I was 7 months pregnant when my husband's secretary told security to escort me out of the building. Even now, saying those words out loud still feels unreal, like I'm describing something that happened to someone else. But it happened to me, and it happened on a quiet Tuesday morning that started like any other. My name is Emily Carter, and 3 months ago I thought I had a stable life, a loving marriage, and a future that felt secure. My husband Daniel Carter ran a fast-growing tech consulting firm in downtown Chicago, the kind of glass tower office you see rising above the river with polished floors and a lobby that smelled faintly of fresh coffee and expensive cleaning products. Daniel had built the company over nearly 10 years, and I had been there through every late night, every stressful launch, every moment when he wondered if the business would survive. I wasn't technically an employee, but anyone who knew us understood that I had helped behind the scenes since the beginning. I organized early investor dinners, helped review proposals at the kitchen table, and sometimes even caught small mistakes in reports that would have cost the company thousands of dollars. When we first got married, Daniel used to joke that the company had 2 founders, one with a title and one without. For a long time, that joke made me smile. By the time this story begins, I was 32 years old and 7 months pregnant with our first child. The pregnancy hadn't been easy. The doctor had already warned me to take things slowly, to avoid unnecessary stress, and to rest whenever possible. But emotionally, I felt hopeful. We had spent years focusing on Daniel's business, and now it finally felt like we were stepping into the next chapter of our lives. I imagined bringing our baby to the office one day, letting Daniel hold our child while the staff laughed and congratulated him. I imagined the quiet pride on his face. At that time, there was only one new variable in our life, one person who had entered the picture just a few months earlier. Her name was Vanessa Brooks, and she had recently become Daniel's executive secretary. On paper, Vanessa seemed perfect for the role. She had an impressive resume, experience working for several corporate executives, and a calm confidence that made people pay attention when she spoke. Daniel hired her after a short interview process and told me he felt lucky to have found someone so organized and efficient. At first, I didn't think much about her. In a company with more than 40 employees, one new hire shouldn't have mattered that much. But over time, I noticed something subtle. Vanessa always acted polite when Daniel was around, but whenever we were alone, her tone shifted just enough to make me uncomfortable. It wasn't openly rude. It was quieter than that, more controlled. Small things. The way she would pause before answering me, as if deciding whether I deserved her attention. The way she would refer to Daniel as Mr. Carter, in a voice that carried a strange sense of authority. The way she sometimes spoke to me like I was a visitor rather than the owner's wife. I tried to ignore it at first. Maybe she was just serious about her job. Maybe I was overthinking things because pregnancy had made me more emotional than usual. Still, the feeling stayed with me. One morning, about 3 months ago, Daniel called me while I was finishing breakfast at home. He sounded rushed, like he often did on busy days. Could you do me a favor? He asked. There's a folder on my desk with the Harbor Ridge contract. I need you to look it over before my meeting this afternoon. Vanessa's coordinating the meeting schedule, but I trust your eye on the details. I remember smiling when he said that. Even after all these years, he still trusted my opinion. Sure, I told him. I'll head over after my doctor appointment. Around 10 o'clock that morning, I drove downtown and parked in the same garage I had used hundreds of times before. The elevator ride up to the office felt routine. My reflection in the mirrored wall showed the curve of my pregnancy, my light blue maternity dress, and the calm expression of someone who believed she belonged exactly where she was. When the elevator doors opened, the office looked the same as always. Phones ringing softly, keyboards clicking, sunlight reflecting off the conference room windows. A few employees greeted me with friendly smiles. Morning, Emily. How are you feeling today? I waved back and walked toward Daniel's office. But before I could reach the hallway, Vanessa Brooks stepped directly into my path. She was holding a tablet in one hand, her posture perfectly straight, her expression controlled in that same way I had come to recognize. Mrs. Carter, she said calmly, I'm going to need you to stop right there. I blinked, confused. Excuse me. Her voice didn't change. Mr. Carter is extremely busy today. This floor is restricted for scheduled staff only. For a second, I thought she must be joking. Daniel asked me to review the Harbor Ridge contract. I said, it's on his desk. Vanessa looked at me like I had just misunderstood something obvious. That won't be necessary. A couple of nearby employees had already gone quiet. I could feel their attention shifting toward us. I'm sorry, I said slowly, trying to stay calm. But I've been coming here for years. Vanessa tapped her tablet once, and then looked back at me. You're not on today's authorization list. The words sounded absurd. Authorization list? I repeated. Then she said the sentence that changed everything. Effective immediately, Vanessa said in a smooth professional tone, you are no longer permitted to access the executive office area. Security has been notified. I stared at her, certain I had misheard. My heart began to beat faster, the kind of sudden rush that makes your ears ring. Vanessa, I said quietly, I think there's been some kind of mistake. She didn't move. She didn't smile. There's no mistake, she replied. And then, without raising her voice, she signaled toward the lobby desk where two security guards were already beginning to walk in our direction. I closed Lily's bedroom door most of the way, but left a small gap so the soft hallway light could reach inside. For a moment, I stood there quietly, listening. The house had returned to that deep evening calm, the kind that makes every small noise feel louder than usual. I heard the faint creak of the wooden floor as I stepped back down the hallway, and somewhere outside a car passed slowly along our street. Normally by that hour, I would be relaxing with a book or watching television before bed, but my mind felt unusually alert. Something about Lily's behavior lingered in my thoughts in a way I could not quite explain. It was not that she had done anything strange. In fact, she had been the easiest child to care for that I had ever met. She followed every instruction, stayed calm, and never complained about anything. Yet the silence surrounding her did not feel ordinary. Margaret had said Lily did not speak because of emotional stress from earlier in her life. I tried to imagine what kind of experience could lead a child to stop speaking entirely. The explanation made sense on the surface, but the more time I spent around Lily, the less convinced I felt. Her awareness was simply too sharp. She responded to every word with precise timing, her expressions always matching the situation perfectly. It was as if her voice had been turned off intentionally rather than lost. I went into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter for a moment. The digital clock on the microwave read 8:47 in bright green numbers. Outside the window, the backyard was almost completely dark except for the soft glow of the porch light near the fence. Everything about the evening looked peaceful, but my thoughts kept circling back to the same question. Why had Margaret seemed so eager to leave earlier that afternoon? Most grandparents would take time to explain details about the child they were leaving behind. Instead, Margaret had spoken quickly, almost nervously, and then rushed out the door. I set the glass in the sink and walked into the living room. The coloring book Lily had been using earlier still lay open on the coffee table. Curious, I picked it up and flipped through the pages. Every picture she had colored looked incredibly neat. The lines were perfect, the colors chosen carefully. Even the pressure of the crayon strokes was consistent. It was the work of someone patient and focused. On the last page she had colored earlier that afternoon, I noticed something interesting. In the corner of the picture, very small but clearly visible, Lily had written her name. The letters were printed carefully in blue crayon. Lily. I stared at it for a moment. The handwriting looked steady and practiced, not like the uneven scribbling many first graders produce. You write very well, I murmured quietly to myself. That detail only made my curiosity grow stronger. A child who could write that clearly certainly had the ability to speak. The thought lingered with me as I turned off the living room lights and began preparing for bed. A few minutes later, I brushed my teeth, changed into comfortable clothes, and stepped into my bedroom at the end of the hallway. The door to Lily's room remained slightly open just as I had left it. As I passed by, I glanced inside. The faint glow of the hallway light revealed Lily lying quietly under the blue blanket. Her eyes appeared closed, and the stuffed bear rested beside her pillow. Everything looked peaceful. I quietly moved on and entered my own room. The clock beside my bed read 9:23 when I turned off the lamp. For a while I lay there listening to the quiet of the house. My mind replayed small moments from the day. The way Lily had watched everything carefully. The hesitation in her expression when she looked at me in the bathroom mirror earlier that evening. The way she had studied my face during dinner like she was trying to understand something important. Eventually my thoughts began to drift, and I felt myself relaxing into the quiet rhythm of the night. I must have been lying there for at least 15 minutes when I heard it. A very soft sound somewhere in the hallway. At first I thought it might just be the house settling the way older homes sometimes do after the temperature drops at night. But then I heard it again. A light set of footsteps moving slowly across the wooden floor. My eyes opened immediately. For a moment I stayed still, listening carefully. The footsteps were small and cautious, almost like someone trying not to wake anyone. I sat up slightly in bed and looked toward the door. The hallway light cast a narrow strip of pale yellow across the floor of my room. Another quiet step echoed in the hallway. My first thought was Lily. Maybe she had gotten up to use the bathroom or needed a glass of water. I slipped out of bed and walked quietly to the doorway. When I looked into the hallway, I saw a small figure standing near the entrance to the kitchen. It was Lily. She stood there in the dim light wearing the same blue sweater from earlier, her small silhouette perfectly still. For a moment, she did not notice that I was watching her. She seemed to be looking toward the front door as if listening for something beyond the house. Lily, I said softly so I would not startle her. She turned immediately, her pale gray-blue eyes finding mine in the dim light. There was no fear in her expression, only that same thoughtful awareness she had shown all day. Is everything okay? I asked gently. She remained silent for a few seconds, studying my face carefully again. Then she slowly walked toward me down the hallway. When she reached the doorway of my room, she stopped just a few feet away and looked up at me. For a brief moment, I thought she might simply nod like she had earlier that day. But instead she took a small breath as if preparing to do something she had been holding back for a very long time. I sat in the lobby for almost 20 minutes before my phone finally rang. When I saw Daniel's name on the screen, I felt a rush of relief so strong that I nearly laughed. Of course he would fix this. All it would take was one short conversation, and the entire strange situation upstairs would disappear. I answered immediately. Daniel, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, there has been a misunderstanding at the office. Your secretary told security that I cannot go upstairs. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by a quiet sigh. Emily, he said slowly, I heard about that. For a moment, I did not understand what he meant. You heard about it? I repeated. Yes, he replied. Vanessa told me you came by earlier and caused a bit of confusion at the front desk. The words made my stomach tighten. Caused confusion? Daniel, I said carefully, I did not cause anything. I came because you asked me to review the Harbor Ridge contract. She stopped me before I could even walk down the hallway. Another pause followed, longer this time. When Daniel spoke again, his tone sounded tired, the way it sometimes did when the company was dealing with a complicated situation. Emily, he said, today is not a good day for this. We have an important investor meeting in less than an hour and Vanessa is trying to keep everything organized. I stared across the quiet lobby, watching people walk in and out of the glass entrance doors while his words slowly sank in. Daniel, I said I am sitting in the lobby right now because your secretary told security to escort me out of the executive floor. I am 7 months pregnant, and she treated me like I do not belong in your office. His response came faster this time, but it was not the response I expected. Emily, please do not exaggerate the situation, he said. Vanessa told me she simply asked you to wait downstairs because the floor was restricted during preparation for the meeting. The calm certainty in his voice made my chest feel tight. I am not exaggerating, I replied quietly. She told the security guards that I was not authorized to be upstairs. There was another silence, and then Daniel spoke again in a tone that felt strangely distant. Emily, listen, he said. The company has grown a lot over the past year. We have new procedures now. Vanessa is responsible for managing the executive schedule and access to sensitive areas. It is her job to keep things running smoothly. For a moment, I could not believe what I was hearing. Daniel, I said slowly, I am your wife. I have been coming to that office for years. You asked me to review a document this morning. I know, he replied, but things are complicated right now. Vanessa mentioned that you seemed upset when she explained the access rules. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to stay calm. Upset was not the right word for what had happened upstairs. Confused would have been more accurate. Hurt would have been even closer to the truth. Daniel, I said carefully. She did not explain anything. She told security that I was not permitted on the floor and asked them to escort me away. I could hear faint voices in the background on his end of the call, as if people were entering his office. Emily, he said quickly, I really do not have time to go back and forth about this right now. The meeting is starting soon. If Vanessa says the floor is restricted today, then it is probably better if you just head home and rest. The words landed harder than anything else he had said. Head home and rest. As if the entire situation was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Daniel, I said quietly, you do realize that everyone in the office just watched your secretary tell security to remove your pregnant wife from the building. That sounds dramatic, he replied, and I could hear a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. Nobody removed you from the building. They simply asked you to wait in the lobby. Emily, please do not make this into something it is not. I looked down at my hands resting on the small curve of my stomach and felt a strange wave of disbelief. This conversation was not going the way I had imagined during the elevator ride downstairs. Daniel was not angry at Vanessa. He was not apologizing to me. Instead, he sounded like he was gently correcting a misunderstanding that only existed in my head. I tried one last time to make him understand. Daniel, I said, I came because you trusted my opinion on the Harbor Ridge contract. That is all I wanted to do. I know, he replied, his voice softening slightly, but today is chaotic here. Let us talk about it tonight, all right? For now, just go home and relax. The doctor told you to avoid stress anyway. Before I could respond, he added one final sentence. Vanessa is doing her job, Emily. Please do not make things harder for her. Then the line went quiet. I lowered the phone slowly and stared at the blank screen for several seconds. Around me the lobby continued moving like any normal weekday morning. People stepped off elevators, greeted the receptionist, and walked toward the conference rooms without noticing the woman sitting quietly in the corner chair. Just 30 minutes earlier, I had walked into this building believing I belonged there. Now I felt like a stranger waiting for permission to enter a place that had once felt like part of my life. And the worst part was not what Vanessa had said upstairs. The worst part was realizing that Daniel believed her version of the story more easily than mine. I remained in the lobby for several minutes after the call ended, still holding my phone as if Daniel might suddenly call back and say that he had reconsidered everything. But the screen stayed dark. The receptionist glanced at me once or twice with a polite smile, probably wondering why I had not left yet. Finally, I stood up slowly and walked toward the glass doors that led outside. The late morning air in downtown Chicago felt cooler than I expected, and I paused on the sidewalk for a moment, trying to steady my thoughts. A few taxis rolled past, and people hurried along the street carrying coffee cups and briefcases, completely unaware that something in my life had just shifted in a way I could not fully explain. During the drive home, I kept replaying the conversation with Daniel in my mind. He had not sounded angry, but he also had not sounded concerned about what had happened. Instead, he had treated the entire situation as if I had misunderstood a simple office rule. By the time I pulled into the driveway of our house, the quiet suburban street looked almost unreal compared to the glass towers downtown. Our home sat on a peaceful block lined with tall maple trees, the kind of place where neighbors waved when they passed by in the evening. I walked inside, set my keys on the kitchen counter, and sat down at the table where Daniel and I had shared countless late-night conversations about the future of his company. The house felt unusually quiet that afternoon. I told myself that Daniel was probably just overwhelmed with work and that we would talk calmly when he returned home later that evening. Still, a small part of me could not shake the uneasy feeling that Vanessa had gained far more influence in the office than I had realized. Over the next few hours, I tried to focus on ordinary things. I folded a small stack of baby clothes that had arrived earlier that week. I organized a few documents for my upcoming doctor appointment. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the moment upstairs when Vanessa calmly told security that I was not authorized to be there. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message. For a brief second, I hoped it might be Daniel checking in. Instead, the notification came from the company email account that I had occasionally used to review documents for him. The subject line read Account Access Update. I opened the message and read it twice before the meaning fully registered. The system administrator had updated security permissions, and my access to the internal company network had been removed. If I believed the email, the change had taken effect earlier that morning. My first reaction was confusion. I had rarely used that account recently, but it had always been available whenever Daniel needed a second set of eyes on a contract or proposal. Now the system was telling me that my credentials no longer existed. I considered calling Daniel immediately, but the memory of his earlier tone stopped me. He had made it clear that he did not want to discuss the situation during his busy day. So I waited. Evening arrived slowly. The sun dipped lower behind the trees outside the kitchen window, and I prepared a simple dinner while keeping an ear open for the sound of Daniel's car in the driveway. When he finally walked through the door shortly after 7:30, he looked exhausted. His tie was loosened and his shoulders sagged slightly as he placed his briefcase near the entry table. "Hey," he said quietly when he saw me in the kitchen. "How are you feeling?" I studied his expression, searching for any sign that he understood how upsetting the day had been for me. "I am all right," I replied carefully, "but we need to talk about what happened this morning." Daniel sighed softly and pulled out a chair at the kitchen table. "Emily," he said, "I thought we agreed to talk about it later when things were calmer." "It is later now," I answered. He nodded and rubbed his forehead as if gathering his thoughts. "Vanessa told me that you showed up during a very important preparation meeting and that the staff got confused about the access rules." I felt the same disbelief I had felt earlier in the lobby. "That is not what happened, Daniel. She told security that I was not authorized to enter the executive floor. Everyone in the office heard her say it." Daniel leaned back in the chair and looked at me with a tired expression. "Emily, the company has reached a stage where we have to follow strict procedures. Investors are watching everything we do. Vanessa was hired specifically to bring structure and order to the executive schedule." I placed my hands gently on the table, trying to keep my voice steady. "I understand the need for organization, but I also received an email this afternoon saying my company account was removed from the system. Did you know about that?" Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes," he said. "Vanessa recommended that we limit network access to official staff members only. Since you are not technically an employee, it made sense to clean up the permissions." The words felt strangely formal coming from my own husband. So after years of helping behind the scenes, I asked quietly, "You decided I should not even have access to the documents anymore?" "It is not personal, Emily," he replied. "It is simply about running the company professionally." I sat there in silence for a moment, absorbing the calm finality in his explanation. Earlier that morning I had walked into his office building believing that I was still part of the world he had built. Now, sitting across from him at our own kitchen table, I was beginning to realize that the door to that world had quietly closed. For the rest of that evening, the conversation between Daniel and me moved in slow circles that never seemed to reach a real conclusion. He insisted that the changes at the company were simply part of normal growth, and I tried to explain why the way it had happened felt deeply wrong. Eventually, the discussion faded into a quiet tension that lingered through dinner and into the night. Daniel returned to answering emails on his laptop, while I sat on the couch in the living room, watching the soft glow of the television without really paying attention to what was on the screen. By the time we went to bed, neither of us had raised our voices, but the distance between us felt wider than the hallway that had separated me from his office that morning. The next day began quietly. Daniel left early for work before I woke up, leaving a short note on the kitchen counter that said he hoped I would have a relaxing day. I stood there reading the note while the morning sunlight filled the room and wondered when our lives had started to feel so carefully scheduled and distant. Over the next several days, I tried to convince myself that everything would eventually settle down. After all, Daniel had always been dedicated to his company, and sometimes that dedication meant he became temporarily absorbed in work. But small details kept reminding me that something had changed. Normally, Daniel shared stories from the office during dinner, telling me about new projects or challenges the team was facing. Now those conversations seemed to disappear. When I asked how things were going, he answered politely but briefly, as if discussing work with me had suddenly become complicated. One afternoon about a week later, I decided to stop by a nearby cafe that overlooked the river. It had become one of my favorite quiet places during the pregnancy, because the large windows offered a calming view of the water moving slowly past the city. I ordered a cup of tea and sat at a corner table, trying to enjoy the peaceful moment. As I scrolled through my phone, an unexpected message notification appeared from a number I recognized immediately. It belonged to Michael Reyes, one of the senior analysts who had worked at Daniel's company for nearly 5 years. Michael had always been friendly with me whenever I visited the office, often joking that I had a sharper eye for contracts than some of the junior lawyers they hired. The message itself was short. "Hey Emily, I hope you are doing well. I heard you stopped by the office last week. Everything okay?" I stared at the screen for a moment, surprised that he had reached out. I hesitated before replying, unsure how much I should say. Eventually, I typed back a simple response telling him that things had been a little confusing, but that I was fine. A few minutes later, another message arrived. Michael wrote that the situation had become a topic of quiet conversation around the office. Several employees had seen the moment when security approached me, and nobody seemed to understand why it happened. According to Michael, Vanessa had explained to the staff that the company was tightening its professional boundaries and that family members would no longer participate in internal matters. I read that sentence twice, feeling the same strange disbelief that had followed me all week. Family members would no longer participate in internal matters. That phrase made it sound as if I had been casually interfering with company operations instead of helping Daniel for years. I asked Michael if anyone had spoken to Daniel about the situation. His reply came after a short pause. He said that most employees were careful about bringing up sensitive topics with the executive team, especially since Vanessa had become the main person controlling the daily schedule. According to him, she managed nearly every meeting request and communication that reached Daniel's office. When I finished reading his message, I leaned back in my chair and looked out the cafe window at the river again. The water moved steadily under the bridge, calm and predictable, unlike the uneasy feeling that had been growing in my mind. Vanessa had only been at the company for a few months, yet somehow she had positioned herself as the gatekeeper to Daniel's time, his office, and even the narrative about what had happened that morning. Later that evening, when Daniel returned home, I considered telling him about my conversation with Michael, but something held me back. Part of me wondered whether Daniel would simply repeat the same explanation he had given before, insisting that Vanessa was only enforcing new procedures. Instead, I asked him a simple question while we were preparing dinner together in the kitchen. Has Vanessa been very busy managing the office lately? Daniel glanced up from the cutting board and nodded. Extremely busy, he said. She has been organizing a lot of operational changes that were long overdue. She is actually helping the company run much more efficiently. I watched his expression carefully as he spoke. He sounded confident in her abilities, almost appreciative of the order she had introduced. That confidence made it harder for me to explain the quiet suspicion that had begun forming in my mind. Because the more I thought about the events of the past week, the more it seemed that the situation was not just about a misunderstanding at the office door. Something deeper had shifted inside the company, and Vanessa Brooks appeared to be standing directly at the center of it. Over the next 2 weeks, I tried to focus on preparing for the baby and keeping my life calm. But the strange feeling that something was wrong at Daniel's company refused to disappear. Every morning, Daniel left the house earlier than usual, often before sunrise, saying the team was dealing with a busy quarter and several new investors. Normally, I would have believed him without question, because the company had always gone through intense periods of work. But this time the situation felt different, almost carefully controlled in a way I had not seen before. Daniel rarely spoke about specific projects anymore. When I asked simple questions about how things were going, he usually answered with short general comments and then quickly changed the subject. One evening, while we were eating dinner, I mentioned that Michael Reyes had sent me a message asking if everything was all right. Daniel paused with his fork halfway to his plate and looked at me with a slightly surprised expression. Michael contacted you? He asked. Yes, I said calmly. He said several employees were confused about what happened at the office that morning. Daniel set his fork down slowly and leaned back in his chair. Emily, he said, I really do not think it is helpful for staff members to discuss internal matters with you right now. That sentence caught me off guard. Internal matters? I repeated. Daniel, the entire situation happened in front of the staff. They already saw it. I am not trying to interfere with the company. I am simply trying to understand why it happened. Daniel rubbed his forehead in the same tired gesture I had begun to see more frequently. Vanessa has been working hard to bring structure to the office, he said. Sometimes people resist changes, especially when new leadership styles are introduced. Leadership styles. The phrase sounded strangely formal when he used it to describe his own secretary. I watched him carefully for a moment before asking another question. Has Vanessa been making a lot of operational decisions lately? Daniel nodded without hesitation. Yes, she has been extremely helpful. She reorganized our internal communication system and tightened financial reporting procedures. Honestly, she has made my life much easier over the past few months. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I quietly finished my meal while thinking about the message Michael had sent earlier that week. According to him, Vanessa had become the central point of control for nearly every document, meeting request, and financial report moving through the executive office. That level of influence was unusual for someone who had only joined the company a few months earlier. A few days later, something happened that deepened my concern even more. I was sitting in the living room one afternoon organizing baby supplies when Daniel's laptop chimed from the kitchen counter. Normally, I never touched his work devices, but the notification sound repeated twice as if a message had arrived urgently. I walked over and glanced at the screen. The laptop was already open, and the preview of the message was visible in the corner. It was an internal company email addressed to Daniel from the finance department. The subject line read revised. Quarterly allocation review. I had no intention of reading private company information, but one line in the preview caught my attention immediately. It said that several payments scheduled under the Harbor Ridge contract had been redirected through a secondary account for administrative processing. My mind returned instantly to the conversation Daniel and I had weeks earlier when he asked me to review that same contract. Harbor Ridge had been one of the company's largest consulting agreements that year, worth several $1 million over the course of the project. Redirected payments through a secondary account was not a phrase I had ever seen in Daniel's standard financial procedures. I stepped away from the laptop and told myself that there was probably a simple explanation. Perhaps the accounting department had introduced a new system. Perhaps Vanessa had recommended a different way to organize incoming funds. Still, the memory of that email preview stayed in my mind long after I returned to the living room. Later that night, when Daniel came home, I casually asked him how the Harbor Ridge project was progressing. His reaction was subtle but noticeable. He hesitated for a second before answering. "It is moving forward well," he said. "Why do you ask?" I shrugged lightly. "You mentioned it a few weeks ago when you asked me to review the contract," I replied. "I was just curious whether everything was still on schedule." Daniel nodded, but did not offer any additional details. "Yes, everything is under control," he said. "Vanessa and the finance team have been coordinating the reporting process." Once again, Vanessa's name appeared naturally in the center of the explanation. I watched Daniel as he spoke and realized something that made my uneasiness grow even stronger. For years, I had helped him review agreements and financial documents at the kitchen table, catching small inconsistencies before they became real problems. Now that role had quietly disappeared, replaced by someone who seemed to control every piece of information reaching him. That night after Daniel went to bed, I remained awake longer than usual, sitting near the window and thinking about everything that had happened since the day I was asked to leave the office lobby. Vanessa Brooks had arrived at the company only a few months earlier, yet somehow she had reshaped the structure of Daniel's entire executive operation. And the more I thought about the strange changes surrounding the Harbor Ridge contract, the more a troubling possibility began forming in my mind. What if the problem was not simply a misunderstanding about office procedures? What if something inside the company itself was no longer as transparent as Daniel believed? For the next several days, I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking the situation, but the uneasy thought about the Harbor Ridge payments refused to leave my mind. I had spent years sitting beside Daniel while he reviewed financial reports and consulting agreements, and I knew the company's habits well enough to recognize when something did not follow the normal pattern. Redirecting payments through a secondary account was not how Daniel usually handled large contracts, especially one worth several $1 million. Still, I also knew that accusing someone of wrongdoing without real proof would only make the situation worse, especially since Daniel clearly trusted Vanessa. One quiet afternoon about a week later, my phone buzzed again with a message from Michael Reyes. He asked if I had a moment to talk. His tone sounded slightly cautious, which made me curious. I called him back while sitting on the back patio of our house where the late spring air felt calm and warm. Michael greeted me politely and asked how I was feeling. After a short exchange about the pregnancy, his voice lowered a little as if he was choosing his words carefully. "Emily," he said, "I hope you do not mind me bringing something up, but a few things around the office have been confusing lately." I leaned forward slightly in my chair. "What do you mean?" I asked. There was a brief pause before he answered. "Several departments have noticed unusual changes in the way financial reports are being processed. Vanessa has been asking the accounting team to route certain transactions through new review steps that did not exist before." His words immediately brought the Harbor Ridge email preview back into my mind. "Are you talking about the Harbor Ridge project?" I asked quietly. Michael sounded surprised that I mentioned it. Actually, yes, he replied. That is one of the main examples. Normally, payments from a client like Harbor Ridge go directly through our primary corporate account. Recently, Vanessa instructed accounting to move those funds through a temporary administrative channel before they are recorded in the final report. I stared out at the quiet backyard while listening to him explain. Do people at the office think that is normal? I asked. Michael hesitated again. Honestly, some of us are not sure. The explanation we received was that it helps simplify quarterly reporting, but a few people feel the process is unnecessarily complicated. That answer did not surprise me. One of Daniel's strengths as a business leader had always been keeping financial systems simple and transparent. Introducing extra layers into the process felt out of character for him. I thanked Michael for sharing the information and ended the call, but the conversation stayed in my mind long after the patio door closed behind me. Later that evening, Daniel returned home looking more exhausted than usual. His jacket hung loosely over his arm as he walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. Long day, he said with a faint smile. I nodded sympathetically, but decided to ask another gentle question. How is the Harbor Ridge contract going this week? Daniel looked slightly surprised again. It is progressing fine, he replied. Why do you keep asking about that project? I chose my words carefully. I spoke with Michael Reyes earlier today, and he mentioned that the accounting process for that contract changed recently. Daniel's expression tightened just a little. Michael should focus on his own department instead of discussing internal matters outside the office, he said. I felt a quiet frustration rising inside me, but tried to stay calm. Daniel, I am not trying to interfere with the company. I just want to understand what is happening. Redirecting large payments through secondary accounts seems unusual. For the first time in several weeks, Daniel's tone became noticeably firmer. Vanessa reviewed the accounting structure and determined that the new process improves internal tracking. She has experience with this kind of system from her previous position. I looked at him steadily. So you completely trust the changes she recommended? Daniel met my gaze for a moment before answering. Yes, I do. She has been extremely organized and detail-oriented since she joined the company. Then he added something that caught my attention even more. In fact, she has probably prevented several administrative errors that we did not even realize were happening before. That sentence echoed in my mind after the conversation ended. Prevented administrative errors. The idea sounded reassuring on the surface, yet it also gave Vanessa a powerful position inside the company. If she was the one identifying mistakes and redesigning the financial systems, then she was also the person controlling how those systems worked. That night after Daniel went to sleep, I sat quietly in the living room thinking about everything I had learned over the past few weeks. First, Vanessa had restricted my access to the office. Then my company account disappeared. Now financial processes were changing in ways that made several employees uneasy. Each event by itself might have been explained as a routine adjustment, but together they formed a pattern that felt increasingly difficult to ignore. I placed my hand gently on my stomach and looked around the quiet house, realizing that I needed to be careful about what I did next. I was 7 months pregnant, and the last thing I wanted was unnecessary stress. But at the same time, I could not shake the growing suspicion that something inside Daniel's company was moving in a direction he did not fully see yet. Over the next week, I made a quiet decision that I did not share with Daniel or anyone else. I would not confront anyone directly, and I would not make accusations, but I would begin paying closer attention to the details surrounding the company. For years, I had helped Daniel review contracts and financial summaries, and that experience had taught me one important lesson about business operations. When something is truly wrong inside an organization, the evidence rarely appears in dramatic moments. Instead, it hides in small patterns that slowly begin to repeat. My first step was simple. I contacted Michael Reyes again and asked if he would be comfortable explaining more about the changes happening inside the accounting department. He agreed to meet me at the same Riverside Cafe where I often spent quiet afternoons. When Michael arrived, he greeted me with a friendly smile, but I could see the same cautious curiosity in his eyes that had been present in his messages. After we ordered coffee, he leaned slightly closer across the table and lowered his voice. Emily, I want to be clear that I am not accusing anyone of anything, he said carefully. I respect Daniel and I value my job. But some of the recent financial procedures do not follow the patterns we have used for years. I nodded, encouraging him to continue. He explained, That Vanessa had introduced a system where certain incoming payments were temporarily routed through what she called a verification account before being entered into the company's primary financial records. According to her explanation, the purpose was to improve auditing accuracy and reduce reporting errors. On the surface, the idea sounded professional and organized. However, Michael pointed out something that made the situation more concerning. The verification account was not part of the company's long-established banking structure. It had been created recently under administrative authorization and was only accessible to a very small number of people within the executive office. I listened carefully while he described the arrangement. Who exactly has access to that account? I asked. Michael paused before answering. From what we understand, the access permissions are limited to Daniel and Vanessa. I felt a quiet chill of realization move through my thoughts. Daniel trusted Vanessa completely, which meant that in practice, she might be the one controlling most of the activity associated with that account. Michael continued explaining that the accounting department simply followed the instructions they received. When funds arrived from clients like Harbor Ridge, they were first transferred into the verification account before being recorded in the official quarterly statements. Eventually, the money appeared in the correct totals, but the temporary transfer created a short window where the transactions were difficult to trace through the normal reporting structure. After our conversation ended, I thanked Michael for sharing the information and walked slowly along the river path before returning to my car. The city looked peaceful that afternoon, with sunlight reflecting off the tall buildings and boats drifting quietly along the water. Yet my thoughts were moving much faster than the calm view around me. The existence of a temporary verification account was not automatically illegal or unethical. Some companies used similar methods during complex audits. But the timing of this change, combined with Vanessa's sudden authority over so many internal systems, made the situation feel increasingly suspicious. That evening, Daniel returned home later than usual, carrying the familiar tired expression that had become common during the past month. We ate dinner quietly, while discussing simple things like the baby's upcoming doctor appointment and the new bookshelf we planned to place in the nursery. Part of me wanted to ask him directly about the verification account, but another part of me recognized that confronting him without proof would only create more tension between us. Instead, I asked a more general question. Have the investors been asking for additional financial reporting lately? Daniel nodded while finishing his glass of water. Yes. The company has grown large enough that transparency is more important than ever. Vanessa has been working with the finance team to ensure our reporting structure is strong enough to handle future expansion. His answer confirmed something important for me. Daniel believed the changes were strengthening the company. He saw Vanessa as someone who was improving efficiency rather than complicating it. That belief meant that if something improper was actually happening, Daniel might be the last person to notice it. Later that night after he went to bed, I sat alone in the living room with my laptop and began reviewing public records related to Daniel's company and its major clients. I was not looking for anything dramatic. Instead, I focused on the type of information that experienced business analysts often examine quietly. Contract announcements, regulatory filings, partnership statements, and financial disclosures that large consulting firms occasionally publish. After nearly an hour of reading through documents, I found a detail that made me pause. The Harbor Ridge project had recently increased in value according to a revised contract statement filed with one of the industry oversight organizations. The updated agreement showed a higher total payment than the original contract Daniel had asked me to review weeks earlier. I leaned back in my chair and considered what that might mean. If the contract value had increased while payments were being routed through a temporary verification account, then the financial movement connected to that project could be significantly larger than anyone outside the executive office realized. At that moment, I understood something clearly. The situation surrounding Vanessa Brooks was no longer just about the day she told security to escort me from Daniel's office floor. It had quietly grown into something much more serious. And if I wanted to protect both my husband and the company he had spent years building, I would need to uncover the full truth about what was happening inside that verification account. That night, after discovering the revised Harbor Ridge contract value, I realized that I had reached a turning point. Until then, I had been quietly observing the situation, hoping that the strange details surrounding Vanessa and the company would eventually reveal an innocent explanation. But the more pieces I uncovered, the more they formed a pattern that felt impossible to ignore. If I wanted to understand the truth, I would need to gather information carefully and patiently. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, organizing everything I had learned so far. First, there was the moment Vanessa told security that I was not authorized to enter the executive floor. Then my company network access had been removed without warning. After that, financial procedures began shifting under her direction, including the creation of the temporary verification account that only she and Daniel could access. Finally, there was the updated Harbor Ridge contract value, which suggested that a large amount of money might be moving through that temporary account before reaching the official records. None of those details proved wrongdoing on their own, but together they created a structure that made careful oversight extremely difficult. Later that afternoon, I contacted Michael Reyes again, asking him if there were any other employees who had noticed unusual patterns in the accounting process. Michael hesitated for a moment before answering. He explained that most people at the company respected Daniel too much to question the decisions coming from the executive office. However, he did mention that one person in the finance department had privately wondered why certain payment transfers were being divided into smaller segments before appearing in the quarterly statements. Divided into smaller segments. That phrase immediately caught my attention because it was a common technique used to disguise large financial movements within complex reporting systems. I asked Michael if he could provide an example without violating company confidentiality. After a short pause, he described a recent payment from Harbor Ridge that had arrived as a single large transfer, but later appeared in the internal reports as several smaller administrative adjustments spread across different dates. The total amount remained the same, yet the path the money followed through the system had become far more complicated than necessary. When I ended the call, I sat quietly in the living room thinking about what that meant. The pattern Michael described was not something Daniel would normally approve. For years he had insisted that the company maintain clean and transparent financial records so that investors could easily understand where every dollar came from and where it went. The system Vanessa introduced seemed to move in the opposite direction, creating layers of complexity that only a few people could fully see. Over the next several days I continued researching quietly. Since I no longer had direct access to the company's internal systems, I focused on publicly available financial filings, industry reports, and contract disclosures connected to Daniel's firm and its major clients. Slowly, I began mapping the timeline of the Harbor Ridge project. The original agreement had been announced 6 months earlier with a specific contract value. 2 months later, an updated filing increased that value significantly, citing expanded consulting services and additional project milestones. Around the same time, according to Michael, the verification account had been introduced into the payment process. The alignment of those events did not feel accidental. One evening about 3 weeks after the day Vanessa asked security to escort me from the executive floor, I received another message from Michael that made the situation even more serious. He told me that the finance department had recently received instructions to prepare a preliminary quarterly report for internal review. During that process, one analyst noticed that several transfers connected to the verification account appeared to move through an external banking institution before returning to the company's primary ledger. The analyst initially assumed it was part of a temporary administrative step, but the timing of those transfers did not match the standard accounting cycle. When I read Michael's message, my heart began beating faster. If funds were leaving the company's internal system and passing through an outside institution before returning, it meant there was a gap in the financial trail where the money could potentially be redirected without immediate detection. That type of structure was exactly the kind investigators look for when examining complex financial misconduct. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the full weight of the situation settle in. For weeks I had been trying to determine whether my concerns were simply emotional reactions to the humiliation I experienced at the office. Now the evidence suggested that something much larger might be unfolding inside Daniel's company. Yet I also understood an important truth. Daniel himself might not be aware of what was happening. He trusted Vanessa to manage the administrative side of the business, and that trust may have allowed her to design financial procedures that operated beyond his immediate view. At that moment, I realized that uncovering the truth was no longer just about protecting my own dignity after being escorted from the office lobby. If money was being quietly redirected through hidden channels, the consequences could damage the company Daniel had spent years building and could even expose him to serious legal scrutiny despite his innocence. Sitting alone in the quiet house that night, I made a decision that would change the course of everything that followed. I would continue gathering information patiently and carefully until the full financial pattern became clear. And when the time came, I would make sure that the right authorities saw exactly what had been happening behind the doors of Daniel Carter's executive office. Over the next several weeks, I continued documenting everything I could learn about the financial patterns connected to the Harbor Ridge project and the verification account Vanessa had introduced. My approach was careful and deliberate because I understood how serious the implications could be if my suspicions were correct. I created a timeline that began with the day Vanessa told security to escort me from the executive floor and extended through every unusual accounting detail Michael Reyes and others had quietly shared with me. Each new piece of information strengthened the same conclusion. Funds connected to large consulting contracts were being routed through a temporary account structure that created moments where the financial trail became difficult to follow. The most concerning discovery came about 10 days after my last conversation with Michael. He contacted me again late one afternoon and explained that the finance department had finished preparing a draft of the internal quarterly report. While reviewing the numbers, one of the analysts noticed that the total revenue reported from the Harbor Ridge contract matched the official agreement amount, but the path the funds followed through the company's accounts included several short transfers to an outside institution before returning to the main ledger. The amounts were not missing. Everything appeared balanced on paper. However, the sequence of transactions created a temporary separation between the incoming payments and the company's official reporting system. That type of separation could easily allow someone with access to move money quietly before it returned to the ledger. When I heard that explanation, I knew the situation had moved beyond simple curiosity. The pattern resembled techniques investigators often describe when examining financial diversion schemes. I also knew that confronting Daniel directly without independent verification might only push him further into trusting Vanessa's explanations. Daniel had built his company through years of hard work, and he believed strongly in the people he chose to work beside. If someone inside the executive office was manipulating financial channels, the truth would need to be presented in a way that could not be dismissed as personal suspicion. That realization led me to take the most difficult step I had considered since this entire situation began. I contacted a professional who specialized in financial compliance investigations and requested a confidential consultation. The person I spoke with was a former federal financial crimes analyst who now worked with private organizations reviewing complex accounting structures. During our conversation, I carefully explained the sequence of events without exaggeration or emotional language. I described the creation of the verification account, the routing of Harbor Ridge payments through temporary channels, and the reports of funds briefly moving through an outside institution before returning to the company ledger. The analyst listened quietly and then asked a series of detailed questions about the timeline and the individuals who controlled account access. After nearly an hour of discussion, he reached a cautious conclusion. Based on the information I had gathered, the structure of the transactions appeared unusual enough to justify formal examination by regulatory authorities. He emphasized that unusual patterns alone did not prove wrongdoing, but the combination of restricted account access and temporary external transfers could attract attention from federal investigators responsible for monitoring financial integrity in corporate operations. Hearing those words confirmed the seriousness of what I had suspected for weeks. At the same time, I felt a heavy responsibility forming in my mind. Daniel's company employed dozens of people and managed contracts worth millions of dollars. If the financial systems had been manipulated without his knowledge, the longer it continued, the greater the risk would become for everyone involved. Over the next several days, I carefully organized the timeline, messages, and publicly available filings I had collected into a clear summary. I did not include speculation or emotional commentary. Instead, I focused entirely on the observable patterns that connected the Harbor Ridge contract expansion with the creation of the verification account and the unusual transaction path described by the finance department. Once the information was structured clearly, I scheduled a formal meeting. with a federal financial investigations office that handled complex corporate reporting cases. Walking into that office was one of the most surreal moments of my life. Only a few weeks earlier, I had been sitting quietly in the lobby of Daniel's company building after being told I was not authorized to enter the executive floor. Now I was sitting across a conference table from investigators whose job was to examine the integrity of large financial systems. I explained the situation calmly and provided the documentation I had assembled. The investigators asked careful questions about Daniel's role, Vanessa's responsibilities, and the timing of the verification account's creation. What struck me most was how methodically they analyzed each detail without rushing to conclusions. By the end of the meeting, they thanked me for bringing the information forward and explained that they would begin a discreet review of the financial patterns I described. As I walked out of the building that afternoon, the sky above the city looked clear and bright, yet my thoughts were filled with quiet uncertainty. I had taken a step that could potentially change everything for Daniel's company and for the people working inside it. But deep down, I also knew something else with absolute certainty. If the financial system surrounding the Harbor Ridge project was being manipulated, the truth would eventually surface. And when it did, the people responsible would have to explain exactly why those hidden transactions had been created in the first place. The weeks that followed my meeting with the investigators moved forward slowly, yet every day carried a quiet tension that I could feel even during the most ordinary moments of life. I continued focusing on preparing for the arrival of my child and maintaining a calm routine, but in the back of my mind I knew that somewhere inside Daniel Carter's company a careful review had likely begun. The investigators had explained that financial examinations often started quietly with requests for documentation and system access, allowing analysts to study transaction histories without alerting anyone who might attempt to conceal irregularities. About 3 weeks after my visit to the federal office, Michael Reyes contacted me again with a message that immediately caught my attention. He said that the finance department had received a request from an external auditing authority asking for detailed transaction logs related to the Harbor Ridge project and several other consulting contracts that had passed through the verification account Vanessa had created. According to Michael, the request had been presented as a routine regulatory review, but the level of detail being requested suggested that the investigators were mapping the complete financial path of every payment connected to those contracts. When I heard that news, I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief because the process had begun exactly as the investigators described, and anxiety because the situation was now moving into territory that would eventually become impossible for the company leadership to ignore. A few days later, another development occurred that made the situation even more serious. Michael explained that the auditing request included authorization to examine the temporary external banking institution where several transfers had briefly appeared before returning to the company ledger. This meant investigators were not only reviewing internal records, but also following the path of funds beyond the company itself. If any unexplained gaps existed in that path, they would soon become visible. During this period, I still had very little direct communication with Daniel. After the confrontation in the office lobby weeks earlier, our conversations had become limited and careful. He continued believing that Vanessa had acted appropriately when she restricted my access to the executive floor because she claimed the change was necessary for administrative control. I could hear the strain in his voice each time we spoke, as though he sensed that something inside the company was not entirely clear, but could not yet identify what it was. One evening, about 6 weeks after my meeting with the investigators, Michael called me with the most significant updates so far. His voice sounded lower than usual as he explained that several senior accountants had been asked to assemble a complete historical report of all transactions processed through the verification account since the day Vanessa introduced it. The report required them to identify the origin of every incoming payment, the temporary destination of each transfer, and the final placement of funds within the company ledger. As the team worked through the records, they began noticing patterns that had never been examined closely before. Certain transfers appeared to leave the verification account and pass through the external banking institution in small increments before returning to the company in slightly adjusted amounts. The differences were not enormous, but they were consistent enough to create concern among the analysts reviewing the data. When Michael described that discovery, I sat quietly for a long moment, realizing that the financial trail I had suspected weeks earlier was now becoming visible to the people responsible for protecting the company's integrity. 2 days later, the situation finally reached Daniel directly. According to Michael, federal investigators arrived at the company headquarters early in the morning carrying official documentation authorizing a formal review of financial procedures connected to the Harbor Ridge contract and the verification account. They explained that the review was part of a broader examination of corporate reporting practices and that the company's cooperation would help ensure the accuracy of its financial disclosures. Daniel reportedly looked shocked as the investigators outlined the transaction patterns they had identified during the preliminary analysis. For the first time, he was seeing the same timeline that I had slowly assembled weeks earlier. The creation of the verification account, the routing of large payments through temporary channels, the repeated appearance of external transfers before funds returned to the official ledger. Each piece on its own could appear administrative, but together they formed a sequence that demanded explanation. Later that afternoon, Daniel attempted to contact me. When I answered the phone, his voice carried a mixture of confusion and disbelief. He said investigators had asked detailed questions about financial procedures he believed were routine administrative adjustments. They had also requested documentation explaining why Vanessa alone had authorized the structure that controlled the verification account. I listened quietly as he described the situation because I knew the moment I had anticipated for weeks had finally arrived. Daniel was beginning to see the financial pattern for himself, and the truth behind those hidden transfers was about to come fully into the open. The day after Daniel told me about the investigators arriving at the company headquarters, the atmosphere surrounding everything felt completely different. For weeks, the truth had existed quietly beneath the surface, hidden inside transaction logs and financial structures that only a few people understood. Now that the investigators had formally stepped inside the company, the questions that had once been whispered in private conversations were being asked directly and openly. Daniel called me again early that morning and asked if we could meet in person. His voice sounded tired in a way I had never heard before. When we met at a small cafe not far from our house, he looked like someone who had spent the entire night reviewing documents and trying to understand how a system he trusted had developed into something so complicated. He told me that the investigators had spent several hours examining the financial records connected to the verification account Vanessa had created. They had also requested full access to the transaction history from the external banking institution where several transfers had temporarily appeared before returning to the company ledger. According to Daniel, the investigators explained that their preliminary review suggested the structure allowed small amounts of money to be redirected during those temporary transfers before the remaining funds returned to the company's official records. The amounts removed during each transaction were small enough that they did not immediately affect the total value reported in the quarterly financial statements. But when the investigators calculated the cumulative impact across multiple contracts and several months, the missing funds represented a very significant amount of money. Hearing Daniel describe the explanation felt surreal because it matched almost exactly the pattern I had suspected weeks earlier when Michael Reyes first mentioned the unusual transfers. Daniel sat quietly for a moment after explaining what the investigators had discovered. Then he asked me a question that carried both confusion and regret. He asked how I had realized something was wrong before anyone else inside the company had noticed. I told him the truth without anger or accusation. I explained that the moment Vanessa told security I was not authorized to enter the executive floor, I knew the decision had not come from him because he had never treated me like an outsider in the company we had built together. That moment made me start asking questions, and each small detail that followed slowly revealed the financial structure she had created. Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finished speaking, he lowered his eyes and admitted that he had trusted Vanessa completely because she always presented herself as someone who could manage the complex administrative responsibilities of a growing business. He had never imagined that the same trust could allow someone to design financial procedures that even the company's leadership did not fully understand. Over the next several days, the investigation moved quickly. Federal analysts reviewed transaction records, interviewed accounting staff, and examined the external banking pathways connected to the verification account. Eventually, the pattern became clear. Vanessa had structured the system so that certain contract payments passed briefly through the outside institution where small portions could be diverted before the remaining funds returned to the company ledger. Because the amounts removed during each transaction were relatively small compared to the total contract values, the financial reports still appeared balanced unless someone examined the exact transfer sequence in detail. When the investigators finished their analysis, they presented the findings to Daniel and the company's legal advisors. The evidence showed that the missing funds had accumulated gradually across multiple contracts over several months. Vanessa was no longer working at the company by the time the full report was completed. The authorities handled the legal process according to federal financial regulations, and the company began implementing a completely redesigned accounting system that required multiple levels of verification for every contract payment. Several weeks later, Daniel and I walked into the company headquarters together for the first time since the day I had been told I was not authorized to enter the executive floor. The atmosphere inside the building felt different from before, quieter, but also more honest. Many employees had already heard that the investigation uncovered financial manipulation that had been hidden within the accounting procedures. As we walked past the lobby desk, the same security guard who had once hesitated to let me enter offered a respectful nod and greeted me by name. Daniel placed his hand gently on my shoulder and said something that stayed with me long after that day ended. He said that sometimes the person who protects a company the most is not the one sitting behind the executive desk, but the one willing to ask difficult questions when something does not feel right. 3 months earlier, I had walked out of that building feeling humiliated and uncertain about my place in the company and in my own life. Now I was walking back in with the quiet knowledge that asking those questions had helped uncover the truth before the damage became even greater. And as I stepped into the elevator beside Daniel, preparing to return to the office we once shared, I realized that the most important lesson from everything that had happened was simple. Trust is powerful, but accountability is what keeps that trust strong.